You walk into a classroom in the light between periods. The room hums with ordinary things. The faint scrape of a chair, the rustle of a paper, the soft clack of a pencil on a desk. People are literally close to one another, and yet there is a distance you can't measure with a ruler. This video asks you to notice that distance and to understand how small, steady human choices close it over time. Act 1. The invisible crisis. You see students arranged in rows and clusters, the morning light angled across their shoulders. They follow routines. They answer when called on. They do their work. From the center of that ordered activity, loneliness can look like nothing at all. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't interrupt class. Instead, it moves in the quiet spaces between directions and deadlines. Loneliness in schools often disguises itself as compliance. You watch a student who sits near the back, hands folded, eyes on the page. They complete assignments. They nod when the teacher speaks. They do not disrupt. In an institution that measures behavior and performance, compliance is assumed to be a sign of well-being. But independence without belonging is a subtle harm. It's a slow accumulation of small invisibilities, not being called on, not being noticed in the hallway, not having a single adult ask a question that isn't about grades or attendance. Statistics matter because they point to patterns you can't see by watching a single classroom for an hour. Loneliness links to anxiety, depression, and disengagement. It reduces curiosity. It narrows attention. But it is not always loud enough to appear on a screening checklist. It is not always dramatic enough to trigger crisis responses. Your task as an observer is not to dramatize what you see, but to recognize how ordinary routines can allow loneliness to persist. Act 2. Why systems miss loneliness. You sit in on a staff meeting where policy and procedure are discussed. Paperwork is reviewed. A researcher sits quietly at the edge of the table, highlighting passages in a report. Policies are designed to prevent harm and to create equitable opportunities. Yet, belonging is not something that can be reduced to forms. Students experience the tone of a school long before they experience the text of a policy. Compliance becomes camouflage. The student who requires little correction is easier to manage and easier to overlook. Systems build around attention to risk and rule breaking, but they routinely miss the damage done by invisibility. You notice how budgets, schedules, and mandates steer adult attention toward measurable outcomes. Emotional presence is harder to measure. It is quieter, cumulative, and often deprioritized. Act 3. Enter Nancy Rappaport's insight. In the counselor's office, a calm adult sits with the reserved student. There are no dramatic confessions. There is no sudden breakthrough. Instead, you witness stillness, a steady posture, a quiet waiting, a low-key question that opens space rather than fills it. Psychiatrist Nancy Rappaport's work reframes the challenge. She argues that before you can help, students must feel safe enough to receive help. Safety is not a checklist item. It is an emotional tone created by predictability, constancy, and the absence of threat. You watch the counselor model that tone. She does not instruct theory on camera. She does not wave hands or perform warmth. Her gestures are minimal, a slow lean forward, a pause that gives the student breathing room, a neutral tone that conveys steadiness. These are not dramatic interventions. They are demonstrations of how regulation precedes relationship. You might expect the fix to be a program or a therapy module. Instead, the fix is the repetition of small behaviors that signal, I notice you. You are allowed to be here without performing. Act 4. What safe spaces actually look like. You should have low expectations for theatrical displays. A safe space in this video is an institutional one, an office, a hallway, a classroom. There are no specially staged rooms, no branded cushions, no slogans on the wall. A safe space is a rhythm of presence. It is predictable interactions that say, again and again, you are not invisible here. The elements are simple and tactile. A teacher pauses at a student's desk to collect an assignment and allows a beat of eye contact. A counselor keeps the same office hours every week. A regulator, an adult whose calm presence stabilizes a moment of tension, waits before responding when a student hesitates. These gestures are not replacements for therapy or instruction. They are the foundation on which those services rest. Act 5. The science of safety. Relational neuroscience gives you a vocabulary for what you are seeing. When the brain detects threat, it shifts resources away from curiosity and toward protection. Threat narrows attention to the self. Learning slows. A nervous system that feels safe can shift back into exploration. A student engages, asks a question, risks a small social risk like speaking up. Regulation lowers arousal. Connection becomes possible. You are introduced to a pattern. regulation before relationship. It's not that adults must be emotionally perfect. Rather, their constancy matters. A teacher who keeps her voice calm in a tense moment, or a counselor who consistently greets the same student. These patterns send the brain a signal that the environment is predictable and therefore less threatening. Act 6. Tiny interventions, big accumulation. In one classroom, you notice how small actions stack. A teacher pauses to offer a neutral comment. "I'm glad you brought that up." A student at the edge of a group lingers after an activity and is given 2 extra minutes of conversation. A school leader walks through the hallways in a steady pattern at the same time each day. None of these actions is dramatic, and none of them is a program rollout. Yet they accumulate into an atmosphere that is distinct from indifference. You observe a slow change. The reserved student who once avoided eye contact now speaks for a brief moment during a discussion. The voice is not a performance of newfound happiness, it is a tentative step toward presence. When safety gains continuity, risk becomes tolerable. Students can try being seen, and those attempts do not result in humiliation or exclusion. Belonging grows not as a sudden reward, but as the product of repeated, consistent signals. Act 7. Patterns that work. Research on school connectedness repeatedly shows the same thing. Being known by even one supportive adult reduces the likelihood of emotional distress. You do not need a dozen certified interventions for belonging to begin. You need continuity. You need the same adult, noticing the same student over time, in ways that do not require the student to perform. Policy can support this by creating space for presence. That means schedules that allow teachers to circulate, staffing that gives counselors regular caseload contact, and professional development that values emotional regulation skills alongside classroom management. It does not require heroic efforts. It requires adjusting priorities. Tiny planning changes yield a different tone across weeks and semesters. Act 8. The role of different adult. Each adult in the school plays a unique role in this landscape. Counselors anchor emotional safety by modeling regulation and offering predictable availability. Researchers carry knowledge without dominating the room. They read, they listen, and they help translate evidence into practice without turning conversation into lectures. Regulators, staff who bring calm presence during moments of tension, do not solve problems for students, but make it possible for students to remain regulated enough to engage. Educators enact daily relational choices: how long they pause, whether they allow a student to finish a thought, whether they circulate in the room. Students, the observers in this system, hold the lived experience. They are ordinary, they are not crises. These roles do not require theatrical compassion or performative gestures. They demand continuity, predictability, and a restrained, consistent approach that makes the environment safe enough for vulnerability to be possible. Act 9. What change looks like over time. You track a classroom over weeks. Change arrives slowly. It is cumulative. You do not expect dramatic scenes, because the video's guiding principle is realism. Emotional change is subtle and understated. A steady adult presence shifts patterns of interaction. Students begin to risk small social actions. They make brief eye contact. They contribute once or twice. They return to a conversation. The culture of a room alters when adults repeatedly convey the same message. You belong here whether or not you perform. The transformation is not a reversal of loneliness in a single act. It is a stretching of possibilities. Where there was once a tight circle of isolation, small openings appear. A student lingers in the classroom at the end of the day because it has become less risky to stay. This is the quiet victory the video attends to. Not a triumphal ending, but an incremental shift that changes trajectories. Act 10. Practical considerations for schools. You do not need to invent a brand new curriculum to make space for belonging. Practical steps follow the same logic of continuity and predictability. Schedule regular, brief check-ins between one adult and a small group of students. These should be consistent in time and place. Protect counselor availability so students can rely on predictable access rather than sporadic contact. Train staff in regulation skills: simple breathing, steady speech, and the art of waiting for a student to finish a thought. Adjust priorities so that paperwork and metrics do not consistently crowd out relational time. Encourage staff to notice and name small acts of presence: a pause, a neutral acknowledgement, a steady gaze. These changes are modest in scope, but significant in effect. They preserve institutional integrity while shifting tone. Act 11. The ripple effect. As predictability increases, the classroom culture softens. One student's small risk, speaking up, staying after class, joining a group, is noticed and held rather than amplified into spectacle. Other students see that risk is tolerated. They follow. The room's relational expectations change. This is the ripple effect you can visualize. Small acts of noticing create a chain reaction that changes how students relate to one another. Act 12. Aligning research and practice. You return to the researcher in the library, flipping through studies on school connectedness and trauma-informed education. The evidence and the observed practices align. Relational neuroscience explains why consistent adults matter. Research on school connectedness demonstrates measurable benefits. Trauma-informed approaches emphasize predictability and regulation. None of this negates the need for specialized mental health support, but it clarifies where that support is most likely to be received, in an environment perceived as safe. Act 13. What lasts? In the late afternoon, an empty classroom sits in quiet light. Chairs are aligned. The evidence you carry away is simple. The most effective supports are often invisible to inspectors and visitors. They don't look like interventions on paper. They look like continuity, the same adult showing up the same way, again and again. They look like an institutional rhythm that says, with modesty and steadiness, you are seen here. In closing, you do not have to watch dramatic conversions to see progress. Progress is slow and accumulative. When predictability, regulation, and presence are sustained, loneliness softens. You have watched a set of modest practices that schools can implement without theatrics. You have seen that belonging is less a program and more a habit. The interventions that matter are low in drama and high in repetition. Steady gestures, regular presence, and the patience to allow human connection to emerge over time. Safe spaces do not demand vulnerability. They make vulnerability possible. When a school's adults keep their tone consistent and their presence predictable, loneliness no longer needs to be a permanent state. It becomes something that, in patient increments, can be eased. Thank you for being present with this story of ordinary actions and the quiet power they hold. For those curious to explore these ideas further, you can find related recordings in our playlist or on this channel. Subscribing allows you to continue following this educational journey, and your comments or likes help guide future content. Thank you for learning with us today, and we look forward to sharing more insights in the next video.